Good evening and welcome. This is a brand new segment of The Lost and Forgotten on TV1. As always, tonight as well, we'll be talking about the contributions of several communities to this nation. Today's topic of discussion will revolve around the Brahmins who settled here in Sri Lanka. At the inception of the show, I'm sure that when we talk about the Brahmins, most of you might relate to the stories of Raman, Sita, and even Ravana. And joining me in the studios to discuss about this story and more is Dr. Zameer Careem from the University of Colombo. Good evening to you, Zameer, and welcome to the show.
Very good evening, Hassaan.
Zameer, as always, we always start our show by talking about the history behind the communities. Tell me the history behind the Brahmin community.
Okay, so talking about the Brahmins who settled in our country, their history can be traced back to remote antiquity. So since time immemorial, that is talking from Ramayana and then talking about Ravana himself was believed to be of Brahmin descent. So from the time of Ravana, and then when we talk about all the Sri Lankan kings, most of the kings of our country, they had courtiers, they had physicians who were Brahmins, they had Purohitas, Rajagurus, chaplains, advisors, royal advisors were in fact Brahmins. We had court physicians who were Brahmins, astrologers who were Brahmins. So during various reigns of different monarchs of our country, so starting from all the way from Ravana's period up until the reign of Sri Jasinghe, there were Brahmins who came from India and settled in different parts of our country. And even now we do have communities. For example, when we talk about the Sinhala and Tamil communities, yes, we do have Brahmins who have in fact integrated well into the mainstream society and have now become part of other communities. And we do have Brahmins still living in our nation, and many of the communities in our country also claim Brahmin lineage. So since time immemorial up until today, the Brahmins have continued to live in the country. It's just that not many are aware of the fact that we do have a Brahmin community, despite the fact that the community has existed in Ceylon since remote antiquity.
When did they start arriving in the country? When did the Brahmins start arriving in the country? And if you may also touch on, let's talk about what attracted them towards this nation as well.
Okay, so talking about the earliest reference to a Brahmin is definitely Ravana. We learn a great deal about Ravana is based on Ramayana. Right, so Ramayana is an epic which was written by Valmiki. So it has like 500 chapters with 24,000 verses, and it was written in Sanskrit. So whether it be the Valmiki's Ramayana or the various adaptations of Ramayana. Now we have Ramayana in different forms, adaptations, impellations, and variations of the original Ramayana depending on the place from where you read it. Like for example, when you take Andhra Pradesh or Tamil Nadu or different places have different versions of Ramayana. You have Kamba Ramayana, then you have Kalidas Ramayana, you have Tulsidas Ramayana, and then Ramayana in other countries. For example, in Thailand you have a different variant of Ramayana, in Laos, in Cambodia, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and then you have different religious depictions. For example, in Buddhism there is a version of Ramayana, in Jainism, in Sikhism, and of course in Hinduism. Now when we talk about the earliest mention of Ravan and about Sita, we talk about Ramayana, which was written by Valmiki, who was a sage. Now according to Valmiki's description of Ravan, who was the king of Lanka, Ravan is believed to have been of Brahmin descent from his paternal bloodline. So his father Vishrava was a great sage, described as being a Brahmin. So his father Vishrava was a great sage, a Brahmin. His grandfather Pulasthya was also a sage, an austere sage who was also identified as Brahmin. And his great-grandfather was God Brahma. So Ravana, the king of Lanka, his great-grandfather was Brahma, his father was Vishrava, a Brahmin sage, and then his grandfather on his paternal bloodline, Pulasthya, was also a Brahmin, hence he was half Brahmin. Now talking about his maternal bloodline, now when we talk about his mother Kaikesha, there are various records that she was a Rakshasa, and then she was a demon, and then she was the daughter of the demon king Suman, and there are various records on her identity, but it is still shrouded in mystery when it comes to the maternal bloodline. Now unfortunately, when we read the Indian depictions of Ravan is portrayed as this demon king or as an asura or a rakshasa, meaning he was an evil, despot, a tyrannical ruler. But on the contrary, even if you read Ramayana, that is whether it be Valmiki's Ramayana or Kamba Ramayana is the Tamil version of it, which was written by Kamban in the 11th, 12th centuries. Now when you read Kamba Ramayana or when you read Valmiki's Ramayana, it is very clearly depicted and mentioned very specifically that Ravan was a maestro of music. He was a great devotee of Lord Shiva. He was a strong devotee of Lord Shiva. He was known for his religiosity, he was known for his religious fervor, he was known for his devotion to Lord Shiva. Hence, he was identified as Lankeshwaran or as Ravaneshwaran. Ishwaran meaning Lord Shiva. So he was such a strong devotee, a staunch supporter of Saivism, and he was known to be a generous ruler, a righteous ruler. And what is interesting to talk about Ravan is that he was an epitome of knowledge. He was a fount of wisdom, right? So he was known to be a predominant, an extraordinary scholar, a phenomenal scholar in terms of medicine. And when we talk about medical treatises and codices, he's said to have written many medical treatises on herbal medicine. Likewise, when we talk about music, he's supposed to have been a great exponent of music as well, right? So he was a great musician. He was a maestro.
Any contribution from his part towards Sri Lanka?
He has contributed so much in terms of the medical treatises, he wrote them. In terms of astrology as well, he was supposed to be a person who was an expert. He had profound knowledge when it comes to astrology as well, and he wrote books on astrology as well. And when it comes to music, he was such a good player of veena that he even in fact invented his own musical instrument, which is referred to as Ravana Hatha. It is played in Rajasthan and different parts of India. In fact, it originated in Lanka. So he was in fact known for his technological advancements.
But it is not played in Sri Lanka
anymore. It is
anymore,
not played in Sri Lanka, but it is believed that when Ravan was defeated by Ram, the Ravana Hatha, the instrument, was taken to India. Then there are various technological advancements. When we talk about Sri Lanka, at the time of Ravan's reign, it is believed to have been a technologically advanced, prosperous, powerful nation. He even owned the flying chariot, the Pushpaka Vimana. So that's how powerful Ravan was. He was a phenomenal scholar, without an iota of doubt. He was known to be a phenomenal scholar, a fount of wisdom, a great leader, and this is what they considered to be the Brahmin qualities, because he was a great scholar, he was well aware of the Vedas, and then he even had profound knowledge even when it comes to Sanskrit. So Sanskrit literature and stuff, he had in-depth knowledge when it comes to Sanskrit texts. So this is Ravan even as described in various texts. Unfortunately, he is depicted as Rakshasa, as an Asura or a demon king. But in reality, Ravan was in fact a great scholar. And why do we consider Ravan, or Ravana as he is described in Sri Lanka, to be a Brahmin, is because when Ram came from India, in order to rescue his wife Sita, who was abducted by Ravana.
Before we proceed further, will you be able to clarify as to why why Sita was abducted?
Okay, so the reason why Sita was abducted, if you read the Indian chronicles or Indian books, they usually mention that Ravan abducted Sita because he had some sort of a lust. But in terms of the Sri Lankan perspective, or when you analyze history from current perspective, it is clear that Ravana's sister Surpanaka's nose was cleaved by Ram's brother Lakshmanan. So Ravan, being an affectionate, doting, loving, caring brother, in order to defend the honor of his sister Surpanaka, that's the reason why he wanted to take revenge. It was as a result of vengeance that he abducted Sita from India and brought her to Lanka. So though there is this story of him being this lustful, promiscuous kind of a king, during her time in Sri Lanka, in Ashokavana, there are no records to prove that Ravan approached Sita in a lustful manner. There are no stories of him being a lecherous man or some kind of promiscuous relationship or some sort of even a salacious conversation.
So where does
Nothing
it all
of that kind has been depicted.
From? Where does it all
This is an Indian version of the story when it comes to Ram approaching Sita with lust. But when it comes to the records, because there are different versions of the story, history is not just black and white. So you have different perspectives and you have various ways through which you can interpret history. So when we talk about even Tamil scholars, or when you talk about the South Indian scholars, they believe that Ravan was in fact a Dravidian. So there is this argument on whether Ravan was a Dravidian or whether Ravan was a Aryan, right? So the reason why Ravan is considered to be a Brahmin on his paternal bloodline, as I mentioned, is because of the fact that his father was Vishrava and he is a descendant of Brahma. That is one reason. The second reason why we consider Ravan to be a Brahmin is because when Ram killed Ravan, that is during the whole battle, and when Ram defeated Ravan and Ravan was slaughtered, he did not return to Ayodhya immediately. So instead of returning to Ayodhya, Ram is supposed to have gone to Himalayas based on certain accounts, and some say he in fact built a temple in Rameshwaram, right, like installing a lingam, and the reason for it being that he had to repent for his sins. He had to atone for his sins. Who had to atone? Raman had to atone for the sins. The reason
killing Ravana.
For killing Ravana, because it was considered as Brahmacidal or Brahma dosha, because Ravan was a Brahmin, in the sense he was at the top in terms of the Varna hierarchy of the caste system of India. So as he stood right at the top, and Ram, who is considered to be the avatar of Lord Vishnu's 7th avatar was Ram. So Ram is a Shastriya because he was a prince, right? And then who later became the king of Ayodhya. So when he came and killed a great scholar, a phenomenal scholar like Ravan, he committed the sin of killing a Brahmin, killing a phenomenal scholar. Hence it was considered as Brahma dosha. So in order to repent for the grave sin that he had committed, it is mentioned even in Indian records that he went to Himalayas and that he had to erect a temple so that he can repent for his sins and observe penance and atone for the sins that he has committed. The major sin being that he was a great scholar, Ravan, and the other being that Ravan was a staunch devotee of Lord Shiva. When Hanuman is said to have come to Lanka, right, in order to inspect, this is before Ram and his entire army came to our country. When Hanuman visited, this is in Kambaramayanam, it is very clearly mentioned that when Hanuman came, right, Pittanam Uranginan, in the sense in Tamil, what it means is even the man who was insane was asleep, because Hanuman came to Lanka, this was in the night, right? So when he visited our country was such a peaceful, prosperous, tranquil nation that even an insane person was fast asleep. That is how well governed our country was. He was a righteous ruler.
This
Ravana.
was during the pre-colonial times.
This is many years before the colonial era, and this is based on this is on Ramayana, the story. So according to Kambaramayanam, in Tamil it is mentioned that this city, this kingdom was well governed by Ravan, who was a righteous ruler. Hence most of the Dravidian scholars, Tamil scholars, believe that Ravan was a Tamilian, he was a Tamilan. While there are many scholars who consider, based on Valmiki's account and various other historical sources, that because Ravan was the great-grandson of Brahma and grandson of Pulastya, that he is of Brahmin lineage. But I do not agree that he is a demon. You cannot consider Ravan to be a demon, because he did not have demonic qualities, because he was identified as a staunch, strong devotee of Lord Shiva and recognized as Lankeshwaran or Ravaneshwaran because of the fact that the term Ishwaran, meaning Lord Shiva, was affixed to his name. That is how strong he was in terms of his devotion to Lord Shiva.
Right. In your opinion, do you feel that Ravana might have been called half demon because of his maternal lineage?
The maternal lineage is still shrouded in mystery. Even if it sees his maternal lineage, when you consider his scholarship, right? He is identified even in Valmiki's account to have been a phenomenal scholar. So he was proficient in Sanskrit literature. He was a maestro of music. He composed books. He wrote books on medicine, on herbal medicine, whether it be Ayurveda or Siddha. Then about astrology. And he was a man who was a staunch devotee of Lord Shiva, as well as he was a descendant of Brahma. And you cannot identify a person of such a lineage with profound knowledge and an erudite figure to be a Rakshasa. So some of the stories over the years, I believe, that have been fabricated, because history is written by the victor. Right? So that is usually the case. So what has happened is most of the stories have been fabricated, have been exaggerated accounts of Ravana are available across the world. But in my opinion, when you consider most of the historians of our country, we surmise with tolerable authority that Ravana was in fact, he is depicted as a righteous ruler. And he did not kidnap Sita in order to have some sort of a promiscuous relationship with her. She was even provided with everything that she required. It is just that it was self-inflicted pain. All the pain that she endured while she was in Lanka was self-inflicted pain. It was not something that Ravan induced. So Ravan is depicted as being a very righteous man, and he is known to, there is no record on him having any sort of lustful feelings towards Sita when it comes to the Sri Lankan version of history.
Let's move on from the Ravanas, the Rams and the Sitas. Let's talk about the ordinary Brahmins who came to Sri Lanka, because I feel that we are running out of time. We have to focus on them as well. When did the ordinary Brahmins arrive in the country?
So talking about the ordinary Brahmins, this is like we have to get into another chronicle, which is Mahabhamsa, right? So the English translation of Mahabhamsa was written by William Geiger and published somewhere in 1912. So when we talk about Mahabhamsa, the earliest reference to Brahmins, you can find many records, but the most significant that I came across was during the reign of Pandu Vasudeva. right? So during the reign of Pandu Vasudeva and Bhaddakachayana, their daughter Umma the Chitra was pregnant and she was expecting a child. Then back then there was a Brahmin astrologer who foresaw the future, and what he mentioned was that if Umma the Chitra gives birth to a son, that son would kill the maternal uncles and seize power. Right? So this is what was predicted by a Brahmin astrologer. That is what is mentioned even in Mahabhamsa. So what happened was, as predicted by the Brahmin astrologer, Umma the Chitra gave birth to a son, and the son went on to live in the village and was raised by the foster parents. And the son came to be called as Pandukabhaya. So there are stories that he was called Pandukabhaya because Pandu from his grandfather Pandu Vasudeva, and Abhaya because his maternal uncle was called Abhaya. Now he was raised in the village, and from the village he was taken to another Brahmin priest known as Pandula. There was a Brahmin priest, a wealthy Brahmin priest who lived in the Pandula Gama, which is in the southern part of the country, where he was taken, and he was in fact taken care of by these Brahmin priests, who is considered to have been an affluent, learned scholar. So it was this Brahmin priest who in fact became Pandukabhaya's mentor, taught him the skills, improved his martial prowess, taught him some military tactics and all those things. And then Pandula supplied him with all the riches when he came to age, and when he was all fit to fight against his uncles. He provided him with all the riches, provided him with the army, and then requested Pandukabhaya, Pandula his mentor, the Brahmin priest, requested Pandukabhaya that when you ascend the throne, you shall appoint my son, right, Chandra, or referred to as Kanda, as your royal chaplain, as your Rajaguru, right? And as what the mentor had requested, when Pandukabhaya managed to seize control and usurp his uncles and became the king of Lanka, he in fact appointed Chandra, or Kanda as is referred to, as his royal advisor. So in fact even Pandula had predicted, the Brahmin priest predicted that he would, that is Pandukabhaya, would one day become the king of Lanka and rule Anuradhapura for 7 decades. And he did rule Anuradhapura for 70 years and became the ruler of Anuradhapura. And this is during the time of Pandukabhaya. Then we come to Devanamptusa, one of the most important kings of Sri Lankan history. So during the reign of Devanamptusa, he sent entourage, he sent envoys to meet Emperor Ashoka. And even when you talk about India, even Chandragupta was in fact crowned by Chanakya, who was a Brahmin. And these stories have also been mentioned in the Lankan Chronicle Mahabhamsa. So Devanamptusa sent his Rajaguru, who is identified as a Brahmin according to the Mahabhamsa, to meet Emperor Ashoka. And Emperor Ashoka treated him well because he was a Brahmin who had come all the way from Lanka.
Zameer, before we discuss further, how many Brahmins were living in the country at
that time? There is
no
record on how many Brahmins, but they held important positions during the reign of various kings. Now during Devanamptusa's reign was when we had the sacred fig. The bo tree was brought to this country all the way from India, and when the bo tree was brought to Lanka, it is mentioned in Mahabhamsa that there were 8 Brahmin families who were requested by Devanamptusa to take care of the sacred fig as custodians. So there were 8 Brahmin families who were responsible to take care of the sacred fig when it was brought to our country. Now this was during the time of Devanamptusa. Then comes the reign of this Anula. Right? I'm sure that many of us Sri Lankans have heard of the story of this queen called Anula. She is considered to have been the first independent, self-governing queen of our country, as well as in Asia, according to various sources. So when Anula became the queen of Anuradhapura, this was 47 BC, that period, what happened was she was known to have been this licentious, promiscuous, kind of a ruler, and she's known to have had many affairs, and she is said to have killed her husbands, she poisoned them. These are all records mentioned in Mahabhamsa. Right? So she was originally married to Choranaga, who was also referred to as Mahanaga originally. That was her first husband. Then she started poisoning her husbands. Right? So this is based on the Mahabhamsa's account. There might be a different version to the story. There might have been court intrigues, and there might have been other reasons why the husbands were killed. But since, the history is written by the victors and you really do not know
what go by the records which are available.
We go by the records what are available. Exactly. So what might have happened would have been very different. But Anula is said to have married a carpenter, and then she married a person called Nilya, who is identified in Mahabhamsa as Damila Brahmin. So her sixth husband was in fact a Brahmin who was in fact the priest of the royal court. So she married a priest and then he became her royal consort and then he ruled for 6 months and then he too was poisoned. So this is according to the accounts, this is based on Mahabhamsa.
Right.
So in Mahabhamsa there are various stories as such concerning various kings, their Purohitas, their Rajagurus being Brahmins. Then we come to the 13th century. I'm talking only about the most important, significant Brahmins in Lankan history.
That is during the pre-colonial period.
This is again pre-colonial period, 13th century. There was this famous king called Pandita Parakramabahu of Dambadeniya. So during the reign of Pandita Parakramabahu of Dambadeniya, there was this very famous medical codex which is referred to as Besaja Manjusa, which means casket of medicine, which is on Ayurvedic medicine and all these native treatments and all those things.
Was it how it was called in
It was called Besaja Manjusa because all these scholars, the Brahmins who came to our country, used to write things in Sanskrit. Okay, so this Besaja Manjusa was in fact written by a Brahmin. Right, so this was during the reign of Pandita Parakramabahu. And then again during the 15th century, latter years of the 15th century, this was during the reign of Parakramabahu the sixth of our country. There was again another Brahmin scholar who came to our country who is said to have composed various works based on Buddhism. Right, so Ramachandra Kavibharati, that was his name. So Ramachandra Kavibharati came from India. He was a Brahmin scholar who came to our nation, a scholar. He was a Sanskrit scholar and he composed Bhakti Sataka and all these Buddhist poems were in fact composed by Ramachandra Kavibharati, who was in fact from India. So there are records of various Brahmins who served as courtiers, as court physicians, even as Purohitas, as royal advisors to various kings. This is during the pre-colonial era, starting from Ravana's time all the way up until the time of various kings. And then during the Portuguese era as well, there were many Brahmins who came to our country.
I think that brings me to my next question, because we need to really speak about how the Brahmins lived in this country soon after the Portuguese, the Dutch and the British arrived in our island. So let's start off with the Portuguese, shall we? Let's talk us through
so during the Portuguese colonial period as well, there were many Brahmins who settled. So one of the most important monarchs during that era was Jasinghe the first of Sitavaka, who was the son of Mayadunda. So he's said to have assassinated his own father, right, the patricidal sin. So he committed patricidal sin. So hence he converted from Buddhism to Hinduism because he had committed a grave sin, that is killing his father. So patricidal sin is considered to be a worst karma according to Buddhism. Hence he converted from Buddhism to Hinduism, who Rajasinghe the first of Sitavaka. And there are certain stories that he did not kill his father and it was a natural death, and all these records are available. When you read the Portuguese chronicler de Cura's accounts, or when you read Joris van Spilbergen's accounts, there is no mention of him killing his father. But Lankan chronicles make mention of him killing his father, and because of this patricidal sin that he committed, he converted from Buddhism to Hinduism. So when he converted to Hinduism, he got down Saivite priests all the way from India, and they settled in different parts of the country. And there are records that he gave Adam's Peak to be controlled by the Saivite Brahmins who came to Ceylon. This was during the reign of Rajasinghe the first. And de Cura's, he gives accounts, he gives details concerning various kings of Jaffna as well. So it is believed that the Jaffna royal family, the Arya Chakravartis in Yalpanam, in Jaffna, it is mentioned that one of the Jaffna princesses married a Brahmin from Rameshwaram, which is in India. And then certain records say that if you read M.D. Raghavan, Dr. M.D. Raghavan's accounts, and this was in the 1920s, Simon Karsichetty's, this was in the early 19th century. So all these records give mention, they give details about the Jaffna royal family having this Brahmin lineage. The reason why we say they have Brahmin lineage, we're not quite sure whether was it a princess who married a Brahmin priest in India or a Brahmin girl who married a Jaffna king. The reason why we consider as Arya Chakravarti is because Arya means Aryan. So the Brahmins are believed to be of this Aryan stock who came from different parts of the world and settled in northern India. So they are believed to have come from Central Asia and various parts. So because the Arya is attached to the Chakravarti, it is believed that in Yalpanam, in Jaffna, that the royal family of Jaffna is also of Brahmin lineage. Then when it comes to the Salagama caste of the low country Sinhalese as well, the Salagama meaning cinnamon peelers, right? So there are various records on their ancestry as well. Now the Karavas, they usually mention that their ancestors were Shastriyas. Then when you talk about the cinnamon peelers, the Salagama caste, some of the records mention that their ancestors hailed from Kerala, they were weavers. Right. Likewise, the Nambudri, they have this Nambudri in their names, and there are various villages in our country with the Brahmin part.
Right.
According to certain sources, the ancestors of the Salagama, because of the fact that they bear Nambudri in their names, the prefix Nambudri, because of that particular reason, some historians surmise that they came from Kerala and they were Nambudri Brahmins. But Professor Gananath Obesekara, who was an emeritus professor attached to the Princeton University, he surmises and he says that it was in fact a way in which they wanted to elevate their status. Hence, they came up with this theory of them being descendants of the Brahmins who settled in our country. Starting from the 13th century, there is a whole account on Bhuvane Kubahu's reign, and then Brahmin priests being brought to this country and all that. From the 13th up until the 17th century, there was constant influx of these Salagamas all the way from Kerala, and who took refuge in our country and settled in different parts of the island. So this is during the Portuguese colonial era. And then during the Dutch colonial period as well, there were many Brahmins. Now the earliest source that we have is of the first Dutch envoy who came to our country, and that is Joris van Spilbergen's account.
I think we spoke about him in the
we
previous episodes.
Speak about him on various episodes. During his period, during his visit, that is during the time of Vimaladharma Surya I. So during his reign, it is mentioned that there were Brahmins living in the Kandyan kingdom.
So they were already living in the country, or did they
were living in the country. They were living in the country, and during the Dutch period as well, there were many who came. So what happened was, after Veera Parakrama Narendra Singha, that is the last Sinhala king of our country, his wife came from the Nayak dynasty, from South India. So during this period, there were many Brahmins who started coming from South India and settling during the reign of the successors, the Nayakar successors of our country, the four successive Nayakar monarchs. During their period, there were many who came and settled in our country. There is this famous medical treatise called Vaidya Chintamani, which was written by a Brahmin physician called Sailendra. It was originally in Telugu, because the Nayakar Rajas, the Vaduga Rajas, were Telugu Rajas. So it was originally in Telugu, translated to Sinhala by Sailendra Singha during the reign of Veera Parakrama Narendra Singha, and this was during the Dutch colonial period. And it was during the Dutch colonial period we hear stories about Joseph Vaas and Carvalho and various Oratorian priests, Jesuit priests, Catholic priests coming to our country. And this was also during Vimaladharma Surya II's reign. This was in 1697. There was a huge smallpox epidemic that devastated our country, a great scourge of mankind, and many died as a result of this dreadful malady. And in fact, it was Joseph Vaas who cured all these people who were seized with this incurable malady. And Joseph Vaas and his nephew Carvalho were in fact Konkani Brahmins who had converted to Catholicism, and then they later came to our country. So there are various stories of Brahmin settlement during different periods of history, and during the Dutch colonial era, as I mentioned, because of the fact that there was an influx of Nayakars, and various Brahmins from South India started settling in different parts of our country.
Very quickly, was life different for them during the period of the British, or did we see priests coming in as always during the period of the British as well?
So what happened was, during the Dutch and the British colonial period, wherever the European colonizers went, they in fact prioritized a certain community. So during that period in our country, unlike in India, according to the Varna hierarchy, the Brahmins held important positions in India. But in Sri Lanka, what happened was, in Sri Lanka, in the low country, the Govigama held important positions, while in the northern parts of the country, in Jaffna and all those regions, it was the Verlalers, right? So Verlalers even had slaves back then. And then in the Kandyan kingdom, it was the Radhalers. So according to Professor Gananath Obesekara, it is believed that these Brahmins, who were in fact the highest, when it comes to the Varna hierarchy, from being Brahmins, they in fact were deposed to being the Sudras, because of the fact that they eventually integrated well into the Goigama caste and the Radhala community, as well as into the Velalers, right? So they became this land-owning agriculture, and they went into various other professions. They were not just priests. But during the British colonial period as well, there were many who even identified themselves as Gurukul, but they're not Brahmins. There was a Gurukul, there was Veera Saiva Gurukuls who lived in various parts of our country. They performed the priestly duties, and then they in fact officiated various marriages and all those things, but they were not Brahmins. But in Jaffna, for throughout the British colonial period, and even until the war broke out, there were many Brahmins who lived in Jaffna, who have been living in that area for a very long period of time. And there is this very famous saying in Yalpanam, in Jaffna, what they say, even my grandmother used to tell me, is that when you cross the ocean, you lose the status of being a Brahmin. Karevatti velipona, you lose your Brahmin status. When you cross the ocean, you lose being a Brahmin. This is like a belief which was held by very orthodox Brahmin families. And during this period, there were many who did come to our country. Physicians came to our nation. I'm sure you must have heard of the Ontaje family. Michael Ontaje, the famous author, Sir Christopher Ontaje and all those. Ontajes are now classified as Chettis and some classify them as burghers. But the progenitor of the Ontaje family, Michael Jurgen Ontaje, the founding father, was in fact a court physician who served during the period of the Dutch that was in India. He was a court physician to the king of Tanjore, which is Tanjavur in Tamil Nadu. And from there he came to Ceylon during the 1650s, during the period of the governor Adrian van der Meyden. Because his wife was seized with some sort of a disease, and in order to cure her, he got down this person, Ontaje, Michael Jurgen Ontaje, who came to Ceylon, converted to Catholicism, married a Portuguese, and his descendants eventually became part of the burgher community and the Chetty community and all that. But the progenitor, according to the records of Hooft, was in fact a Brahmin who came from Tanjore. And then during the British colonial period, there were many Brahmins who came to our country. The most notable among them was Nadesan Iyer, who was in fact a member of the State Council of Ceylon. This was in the 1930s and 40s. He was an editor of a Tamil newspaper called Desa Nesan, right? And he played an important role in Lankan politics, and he fought for the rights of the Indian labourers, the indentured labourers who were brought to the country during the British colonial period. A staunch politician, he was in fact revered by many, especially in his constituency, which is Hatton. So there are many Brahmins who have left their mark when it comes to the history of our nation.
Zameer, unfortunately we are running out of time, but I need to draw your attention very quickly to a point that you mentioned at the beginning of the show. You said that most of us are not aware of the fact that there are Brahmins living in the country right now. How many are living?
There is no exact record on how many Brahmins are living in the country. There were, in fact, recent immigrants, as I mentioned, during the British colonial period. There were many Iyers. Iyers are the Saivites, and the Vaishnavites are Iyengars, who came from Tamil Nadu and settled in different parts of our country. There are Brahmins. In fact, my very first Tamil teacher was a Brahmin. And likewise, even in school, there were many Brahmins at Royal who were, in fact, prefects, very senior prefects, but they were also Brahmins. There is a small community of Brahmins still living in the country, but majority of them, as I have mentioned in various episodes, after the Sinhalone Act, many of them in fact migrated. And my mother had a Brahmin friend who hailed from this Sharma clan, Sarma. There were many Sharmas, but identified as Sa instead of Sh. So there were many Sarmas who were living in Ceylon as well during the, even after we gained independence. But after the India Repatriation Bill and after the Sinhalone Act in 1956, many migrated and sought refuge in different parts of the world.
Thank you very much as always, Zameer, for providing us an interesting outlook on the Brahmin community of Sri Lanka. We'll be back next week as well with another interesting discussion. Do stay with us and take care.